Gather your fellow knights radiant, speak those ideals, and let's talk about whether or not Edgedancer is a journey worth taking. Welcome to the Pop Docs channel. My name is Joseph, one half of the Pop Docs, back with another book review today, jumping into the Cosmere, leaping into the Stormlight Archive, and discussing the novella Edgedancer by Brandon Sanderson. Avid readers of Mr. Sanderson's work are likely familiar with both the Cosmere and the Stormlight Archive, and if you are among them, please do not hesitate to jump forward to the timestamp that's included in the video description to leap right into the discussion and conversation about Edgedancer. For those watchers who are a little more unfamiliar with Mr. Sanderson's work in the Cosmere, I do want to take a few moments to briefly talk about the Cosmere, the Stormlight Archive, and Edgedancer's place within that larger body of work. So what is the Cosmere? The Cosmere is the fictional universe that Mr. Sanderson has created in which many of the stories he has written take place. It is composed of a multitude of planets on which there are different individuals, characters, societies, states, dynamics, conflicts, and even magic systems, although they are all joined with a common cosmology that characterizes the foundation of the Cosmere, has had rippling effects throughout the lifespan of the Cosmere. And the Cosmere is made up of stories told through novels, through novellas, through short stories, through even graphic novels. Oftentimes, these are depicting unique stories on different planets within the larger Cosmere, with unique individualized characters and plot lines and conflicts and dynamics. Although as the Cosmere has grown over time, with each entry in the Cosmere written by Mr. Sanderson, beginning with his debut novel, Elantris, the Cosmere has become a little more interconnected over time and seemingly is continuing to grow even more interconnected, with characters from different series jumping over into other series, crossing over into other plot lines, the like, mixing even potentially magic systems across different series. And although a lot of these connections at the moment are quite subtle and almost border on essentially Easter eggs, it seems like as the Cosmere continues to grow, those connections are becoming more distinct and more integral to understanding the larger Cosmere, certainly, but certain aspects of the different series that occur within the larger Cosmere. One of those series that occurs within the Cosmere is the Stormlight Archive. It's a planned 10-book series split into two parts. The first 5 books are intended to be one part of the story. The second 5 books intended to be part of the second part of the story. As of the recording of this video, Mr. Sanderson is 52% of the way through writing the first draft of the 5th book in the Stormlight Archive, the culmination of part 1 of the Stormlight Archive. And so as that implies, there have been 4 previous novels published in the Stormlight Archive, beginning with The Way of Kings, then turning to Words of Radiance, the 3rd book being Oathbringer, and the 4th book, the most recent entry, being Rhythm of War. One of the things I love about the Stormlight Archive, and I must confess the enjoyment that I have reading these stories, diving into the world of Roshar, following the characters in the Stormlight Archive, is the way that he builds the world of Roshar and expands the story of the Stormlight Archive within each of these novels through the use of interludes that are interspersed at different points in each of the 4 novels of the Stormlight Archive. These interludes take us into new areas of Roshar that we either have not visited in the main narrative of the story or have only tacitly encountered or experienced in the main narrative of the story. These interludes also either introduce us to new characters in the world of Roshar or help expand on more tertiary characters in the main narrative of the Stormlight Archive. And one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight the interludes is not only because I think this is an awesome part of the Stormlight Archives and the way that Mr. Sanderson has constructed the Stormlight Archive. It's because they have also been the origin for these two novellas, the first one being Edgedancer, the one I will be talking about in this video, and then Dawnshard, the second novella that I'll be doing a video on in the coming days. And it's in these novellas that Mr. Sanderson really expands on some of these characters that we've come to discover and follow in these interludes throughout the first four novels of the Stormlight Archive. Notably, Edgedancer takes place between the events of Words of Radiance and Oathbringer. Dawnshard takes place between the events of Oathbringer and Rhythm of War. Why do I highlight the chronology, the timeline of these particular stories? That is because although I am intending to keep this video, my views on Edgedancer, non-spoilery, it's going to be difficult to mention some things that occur within Edgedancer without necessarily being non-spoiler in terms of The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance. So, if you're concerned about spoilers for those first two entries in the Stormlight Archive, please bookmark this video and come back and join the conversation after you've read both The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance. So, what is Edgedancer about? As I alluded to, this picks up the journey, the adventures of one of those characters that we meet in the interludes in Words of Radiance. We are following Lift and Wendell, her companion, on an adventure. And I want to read directly from the synopsis of this novella that is included on this edition of the novella here. So, Edgedancer is characterized as follows. 3 years ago, Lift asked a goddess to stop her from growing older, a wish she believed was granted. Now, in Edgedancer, the barely teenage, nascent Knight Radiant finds that time stands still for no one. Although the young Azish Emperor granted her safe haven from an executioner she knows only as darkness, court life is suffocating the free-spirited Lift, who can't help heading to Yidao when she hears the relentless darkness is there hunting people with budding powers like her. The downtrodden Yidao have no champion, and Lift knows she must seize this awesome responsibility. So what did I think about Edgedancer? I struggled to get through this particular novella in the Stormlight Archive in the larger Cosmere. I actually started and stopped reading Edgedancer multiple times. And so there's probably going to be more nays than yays in this segment of the video talking about Edgedancer. I want to describe in non-spoiler fashion what worked for me and what didn't work for me. And so much of it stems from Lift as the central protagonist of this particular story. And I have had a frustrating relationship with Lift as a character in the Stormlight Archive. For much of the time that she spends on the pages of the Stormlight Archive, I haven't enjoyed reading about her character or her exploits. She feels very out of place in the serious tone, serious environment context of the Stormlight Archive because of her silliness. The way she describes her abilities, the way she goes through her different storylines, her interactions with her spren, Wendell, it all is very, very silly, and I think is meant to inject humor into the story, but it's humor that just doesn't work for me personally, and this is very much a subjective qualification for my perspective of Edgedancer in particular, and the times that Lift shows up in the novels of the Stormlight Archive. And ultimately, that was the difficulty I had in starting and finishing Edgedancer, was I just have a difficult time following the adventures of this particular character, particularly when they're the point of view character in the novella, in specific chapters or interludes in the larger Stormlight Archive series. And so that ultimately was the big obstacle I had in getting into this story and ultimately enjoying this story. But having said that, there were some aspects, having gotten through Edgedancer, that I really did come to enjoy. The first yay I have for Edgedancer is the fact that, yes, it's a novella, but it is quite a quick read. The edition that I have of Edgedancer is only 265 pages. A good portion of that is a prologue that is essentially retelling the events of the interlude in Words of Radiance, and so it's easily really 220 pages of this new story in which Lift is off on adventures with her spren Wendell. And so that is one aspect that I enjoyed. It was a quick read. It was an engaging read, especially the second part of the story. I thought the first part of the story dragged a little bit, but once the supporting cast of characters, particularly the character that she refers to as Darkness, the antagonist of the story, enters the scene, enters the narrative, leading then to the interactions between Lift and this character of Darkness, who is going to be a familiar face for readers of the Stormlight Archive and is going to be and is a key player, a key supporting character in the larger Stormlight Archive narrative. But once those interactions start to take place, the story really, I think, finds its legs and takes off running. And I really did enjoy that latter half of the book and the action that takes place in the latter half of the book and the interactions between those characters in particular. But the rest of the supporting cast I also found really interesting and really enjoyable to read, all the way from a local captain in the guard of the city of Yidao in the land of Tashik. And every time Tashik made an appearance on the page, all I could think about was Star Wars and Kashyyyk, waiting for Wookiees to show up. But whole nother conversation, and oftentimes my mind immediately goes back to Star Wars, given my love and fandom of that particular series and franchise. Nevertheless, this particular guard, captain of the guard of this city in Tashik, was really interesting. The space that she had on screen, if you will, on page. Loved Wendell, Lift's spren. The interactions Wendell had with Lift, although Lift's responses and the way she treated Wendell grated on my nerves at different points throughout the story. It goes back to some of the frustrations I have with reading and following the exploits of this particular character. Nevertheless, I really enjoyed Lift's spren, Wendell, and everything Wendell did in this story. I enjoyed this old philosopher that Lift encounters through the story and then has a through line through the rest of the story. I won't get into spoilers here in Edgedancer, but I think this particular character is going to have a role to play in the larger Stormlight Archive, the larger Cosmere. Nevertheless, supporting cast I thought was a real strength, and I wish I would have gotten more POV chapters from some of these other supporting characters in the story, and maybe divided some of the page time between Lift and these other supporting characters in the story. Turning to Lift, because I think Lift is a good bridge between both the yays and the nays for me in this particular story, because I really enjoyed Lift in the latter portion of this story. The first half of this story, she very much was kind of that silly, comedic, comical, humorous character that I didn't relate to, didn't enjoy following from Words of Radiance, and certainly leading that into the first part of this story. But in the second part of this story, we've really get into Lift's head and start to see how she views herself, how she views her place in this larger world. We get a lot more introspection and reflection of Lift as a character. And I love that. We had all these quiet moments that actually really endeared me to this character and raised her in my own estimation. And I wish I actually got more of those moments from her in this novella, because I thought those really worked, and it really helped me to understand this character more, and actually kind of blunted some of the irritation I got from her external appearance. Her external silliness is really a mask for what's going on within her own psyche. And so I loved those particular moments. Having said that, moving then to the nays, a lot of these poignant moments in the story I felt were undermined, because several of them culminated or ended with, again, a quip from Lift, diving back into the silliness of the character, that humor that just doesn't work for me. And so, although her character has grown in my estimation, as a result of getting through Edgedancer, she's still not one of my favorite characters in the Stormlight Archive, certainly not in the Cosmere. But I think there are ways, for me personally, in my own subjective view of this character of the larger story, that she can really become a character I want to follow, I want to read about. She's just not there yet for me personally. Having said all that, I'm sure that there are many viewers, many readers of the Cosmere that really love Lift and love this character. But for me, she falls into the same category as a Wayne from Mistborn Era 2 from the Wax and Wayne series. Also, if you've read Tress of the Emerald Sea, there's a review on this channel of Tress of the Emerald Sea. The character of Huck in that story. All these characters, their humor just doesn't work for me personally. And so those characters tend to take me out of a lot of these stories. And so ultimately I have a difficult time reading interlude chapters or even novellas from the point of view of these characters, although it's getting a little easier having gotten through the second half of Edgedancer. So both a yay and a nay for me on the character of Lift, particularly when Lift is situated as the central figure, the primary protagonist of the story, the main POV character that we're following throughout much of the story. I also thought the end, although I liked it, I liked the pacing of it, I liked the action of it, I liked the culmination of it, the character moments at the end of the story, not only for Lift, but also for some of the supporting characters as well. I felt the lead up to it was unearned. I didn't think Lift really reasoned out what was going on, really was able to get through and reason through the different dynamics of the plot points that ultimately led to the culmination of this story. It felt more like she fell into a lot of what she needed in terms of the information to get her from point A to point B to point C, etc., etc. And so I didn't feel as though Lift, kind of as an investigator, if you will, was very capable. And so ultimately for me, the end point, even though I liked a lot of the beats and the moments at the end of the story, they did still feel quite unearned, and that the plot was a little muddled. So to summarize my yays and my nays, the book was a struggle out of the gate. And for probably the first 100 pages or so, it was plodding. The reason why I put it down several times, but ultimately want to revisit it because I do really love the Stormlight Archive. I really enjoy the Cosmere, and I want to read everything about these different environments, characters, stories that Mr. Sanderson writes and publishes. And so I wanted to get through Edgedancer. And I'm ultimately happy that I did so. Like I said, the second part of the story, I think, is really the strength of the story, and it really picks up halfway through, roughly, when the main antagonist appears on the scene, and we really then launch into the main conflict of this particular story. Out of 10, I would therefore give this a 5, considering I didn't like half of it, liked the other half. And so very much middle of the road rating for me. Would I recommend this to readers? If you are an avid reader of Mr. Sanderson's work, particularly the Cosmere, and more particularly the Stormlight Archive, certainly I would dive into this particular story. Even if you've struggled like I have with the character of Lift and her adventures on page thus far in the Stormlight Archive, I still would recommend giving this a read because, like I said, she did grow on me as a character over the length of this novella, and it ultimately is a fairly quick read. And so I would certainly recommend, even for those that aren't enamored by this particular character, to give Edgedancer a shot. Also because Edgedancers are really cool. And I didn't say this in the main part of the review, but I think this particular Order of the Knights rating is one of the coolest. And I love the Edgedancer abilities. And so seeing Mr. Sanderson also depict how Edgedancers like Lift can utilize their powers in battles and skirmishes and interactions is really cool. And so I do think that that would certainly fall under a yay. I love seeing the depiction of Edgedancers. Want to see more Edgedancers in the remainder of the Stormlight Archive. Big thumbs up on the Edgedancers side of things. If you like book reviews, if you like talking about popular culture and all of its different manifestations, whether it's novels, novellas, short stories, television shows, films, talking about going to conventions, please think about joining and subscribing to the Pop Docs channel. We talk about all of these different manifestations in popular culture, given our views and opinions and reviews of these different manifestations of popular culture. But with that, for this particular video, the Pop Docs Clinic is now officially closed.